You begin with a certainty that rarely feels questioned. You assume that knowing happens somewhere. Thoughts appear, judgments form, recognition occurs, and you instinctively believe there must be a place where this knowledge resides. You call that place me. Yet the moment you try to identify where knowing actually is, the certainty weakens. Is it in thought? Thought is already known. Is it in memory? Memory is also known. Is it in the body or the brain? These two appear as objects of recognition. The question becomes unavoidable. If everything you can point to is something known, where is the knowing itself? Ibn Arabi challenged this assumption directly. He did not ask what you know. He asked whether the one who claims to know can be found at all. If knowing has no location, what exactly do you mean when you say, I know? Ibn Arabi lived in an intellectual world that valued clear definitions and stable categories. Knowledge was assumed to belong to a knower. The self was treated as a definable entity. God, creation, and human understanding were carefully distinguished. Ibn Arabi did not reject this structure outright. He examined it from within. His concern was not belief, but coherence. He asked whether the foundations of knowledge were as secure as they seemed. If knowledge requires a knower, and the knower must itself be known to exist, what establishes that certainty? His inquiry returned again and again to this problem, revealing tensions that formal theology and philosophy often left untouched. If certainty depends on knowledge, and knowledge depends on knowing, where does the chain truly begin? You rarely notice the assumption operating quietly beneath your experience. You assume there is someone inside who knows. Experiences arise, and you believe there is an inner center receiving them. This feels obvious. Yet, when you look carefully, every candidate for this center appears after knowing they are already present. Thoughts arise and are known. Memories surface and are known. Personal traits are recognized and described. Ibn Arabi pressed this observation with precision. If the knower can be observed, then it cannot be the source of knowing. What you call the knower is always something that appears within awareness. The idea of an inner knower begins to look less like a fact and more like a habit formed by repeated thinking. If the knower is always something known, what has been left unquestioned? You speak of knowing as something you possess. You say, my awareness or my understanding. Yet possession implies separation. There must be an owner and something owned. Ibn Arabi questioned whether this structure truly applies. Knowing occurs. That much is undeniable. But does knowing announce an owner? Does it indicate that it belongs to anyone? When you look directly, knowing does not present itself with a label of ownership. The sense of possession appears later, when thought reflects on experience and assigns responsibility. Knowing itself is simpler than that. It happens without declaring where it belongs. The assumption that it is yours may be an interpretation added after the fact. If knowing does not claim an owner, why are you so certain that it belongs to you? When ownership feels uncertain, you often turn to location. You try to place knowing somewhere specific. You point to the mind, the brain, or the body. These references feel reasonable and even scientific. Yet each of them is something that can be observed and described. They are known. Ibn Arabi highlighted this mismatch. Location applies to objects, processes, and events. Knowing is not encountered as any of these. The moment you attempt to locate it, you substitute something observable for what makes observation possible. The search for a location quietly replaces knowing itself with a concept about knowing. What you find is never knowing. only an idea formed within it. If knowing is not found among the things it reveals, where does the search actually lead? Ordinary thinking divides experience into two parts. There is a subject who knows and objects that are known. This division feels fundamental. Ibn Arabi questioned whether it truly is. When knowing occurs, it does not arrive divided. The separation appears only when thought reflects on experience and assigns roles. Before that reflection, there is simply knowing taking place. Subject and object are distinctions created after the fact. They may be useful for explanation, but they may not describe what is actually happening. The assumption that knowing requires two sides may be an interpretive layer rather than a basic structure. If subject and object arise through thought, what exists before thought draws that line. You experience continuity in your life. Memories connect. Preferences repeat. Decisions follow patterns. From this continuity, you infer a stable self. Ibn Arabi treated this self not as a given, but as a conclusion. Knowing registers patterns, and thought organizes those patterns into an identity. The identity explains the continuity, but it is itself something known. It appears within awareness, just as thoughts and memories do. It does not stand apart from knowing as its source. The self begins to look like a narrative formed to make sense of experience rather than an entity producing it. If the self is inferred from knowing, then knowing cannot be inferred from the self. What then is knowing dependent on? The idea of centerless knowing can feel unsettling at first. You may assume it implies confusion or disorientation. Ibn Arabi argued the opposite. Knowing continues exactly as before. Thoughts are recognized. Experiences are registered. Distinctions are made. What changes is only the assumption of a central witness. Knowing does not stop functioning when the idea of a self is questioned. It functions without interruption. The sense of a center may arise as a practical orientation for daily life, but it is not structurally required for knowing to occur. Knowing does not depend on a focal point to operate. If knowing functions without a center, what role does the idea of I actually serve? At this stage, explanation begins to show its limits. Any attempt to describe knowing risks turning it into an object. Ibn Arabi recognized this boundary and did not try to escape it through symbolism or emotional language. He allowed the limit to stand. Knowing can be recognized, but it cannot be captured without distortion. It can be discussed, but it cannot be contained by concepts. This is not a failure of thought. It reveals the structure of thought itself. Thought works by defining and separating. Knowing is what makes definition possible, not something defined by it. If knowing cannot be explained without being reduced, what kind of clarity is still possible? You are not asked to abandon thought or adopt a new belief. The inquiry simply exposes what has been assumed. Knowing is present. It does not require confirmation. It does not need to be owned, placed, or defended. Ibn Arabi's teaching does not offer a final answer to hold on to. It removes false certainty. What remains is recognition without grasping. You see that knowing was never missing. The effort to ground it created unnecessary complexity. Recognition does not add anything new. It subtracts an assumption. If nothing needs to be established, what remains to be done? The search for the location of knowing ends not with discovery, but with release. Knowing was never hidden, and it was never elsewhere. The problem arose from the attempt to place it. Ibn Arabi's insight is not a doctrine to accept, but a correction of orientation. Knowing does not belong to you, and it does not stand apart from you. These distinctions depended on assumptions that no longer hold. The question of location dissolves, not because it has been answered, but because it is no longer required. Knowing remains, exactly as it always was. The inquiry comes to rest without conclusion. When knowing no longer needs a place, what question is left to ask?